The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Chicago estate auction house, casting long shadows across rows of forgotten treasures waiting to be claimed by new owners. Among the mahogany furniture, oil paintings in gilded frames, and sets of fine china, a small object sat almost unnoticed on a corner table. A jewelry box no larger than a shoebox, its surface covered in burgundy velvet that had faded to a dusty rose after decades of existence. The auctioneer had catalogued it simply as decorative box, circa 1920s, minor wear, and estimated its value at perhaps $20. To the casual observer, it was exactly what it appeared to be, an ordinary container for keeping brooches and earrings, the kind that might have sat on 1,000 vanity tables in middle-class homes across America during the Jazz Age. Margaret Chen had not come to the auction looking for jewelry boxes. She had come because her grandmother's estate was being liquidated, and she wanted to reclaim some piece of family history before strangers carried it all away. She moved through the crowded preview room with a heaviness in her chest, recognizing almost nothing. Her grandmother had been a woman of few words about her past, offering only fragments of stories that never quite connected into a complete picture. Margaret knew that her grandmother had worked as a seamstress in Chicago during the 20s, that she had never married, and that she had somehow managed to purchase a small house during the Depression, an extraordinary accomplishment for a single woman of limited means. Beyond these bare facts, there was only silence. The jewelry box caught Margaret's attention not because it was beautiful, though it possessed a certain worn elegance, but because something about its proportions seemed wrong. She had restored antique furniture as a hobby for years, and her eye had developed an instinct for hidden compartments and false bottoms. This box sat too high on its base. The velvet covering appeared slightly too thick on the sides. When she lifted it, the weight distribution felt unusual, as though the interior space did not account for the full dimensions of the exterior. "Where are you calling from? I want to know." Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. Margaret turned the box over in her hands, examining the brass corners that had tarnished to a greenish patina, running her fingers along the seams where the velvet met the wooden frame. The lock had been broken long ago, the mechanism hanging loose, and when she opened the lid, she found exactly what she expected: a shallow tray lined with faded silk, divided into small compartments that would have held rings and necklaces. But beneath that tray, her fingers detected a ridge, an almost imperceptible edge that suggested the bottom was not solid. She glanced around the auction room, suddenly aware of her racing pulse. No one was watching. The other preview attendees were absorbed in examining silver tea services and porcelain figurines. Margaret worked her fingernail into the seam she had discovered, and with a soft click, a false bottom lifted away. Beneath it lay a second compartment, this one containing not jewelry but paper. A stack of documents tied with a ribbon that had once been white but had aged to the color of old ivory. Her hands trembled as she removed the bundle and untied the ribbon, revealing letters, receipts, and what appeared to be a ledger written in neat, cramped handwriting. The top letter bore a date, March 1924. The signature at the bottom made her breath catch in her throat. It was her grandmother's name, but the words above it were unlike anything Margaret had imagined her grandmother would write. "I received your payment for services rendered," the letter began, "and I have secured the necessary documentation as requested." The gentleman was most cooperative once he understood the consequences of refusal. "I trust this concludes our business to your satisfaction." The letter was addressed to someone identified only as R.M. and made reference to the usual arrangement and compensation as agreed. Margaret's fingers felt cold as she reached for the next document, a receipt for $200, an enormous sum in 1924, paid to her grandmother for something described cryptically as information and silence. Below that were more letters, more receipts, each one revealing a pattern of payments made and received over a period of several years. Some came from individuals whose names Margaret vaguely recognized as belonging to prominent Chicago families of that era. Others were from businesses that no longer existed. All of them suggested that her grandmother had been involved in something far more complex than hemming dresses and sewing buttons. The ledger proved to be the most disturbing document of all. It contained entries spanning from 1922 to 1927, each one recording dates, Initials, amounts of money, and brief notations that read like code. T. Photographs secured, $150. L. Letter retrieved, $75. W.K. Testimony prepared, $200. Page after page of similar entries, all in her grandmother's precise handwriting, all suggesting a systematic operation that had nothing to do with seamstressing. As Margaret read, a picture began to emerge of a woman who had built a second, hidden career alongside her legitimate work. A woman who dealt in secrets, leverage, and information. The amounts recorded in the ledger totaled several $1,000s, explaining how a seamstress with no family support had managed to purchase property during the Depression. The money had come from blackmail. Margaret's mind reeled as she tried to reconcile this discovery with her memories of her grandmother, a quiet woman who had read poetry in the evenings, who had taught Margaret to sew with infinite patience, who had seemed to exist in a state of perpetual melancholy that Margaret had always attributed to loneliness. How could that gentle presence have been the same person who had written these cold, businesslike letters demanding payment in exchange for silence? And what secrets had she collected? The documents themselves offered only fragments, careful to avoid explicit details that might incriminate their author. They were the work of someone who understood the value of deniability, who knew how to create just enough evidence to prove capability without providing proof of specific crimes. One letter stood out from the others because of its tone. Unlike the businesslike correspondence that made up most of the collection, this one was personal, almost desperate. It was dated December 1926 and addressed simply to Rose. Margaret recognized the name. Rose had been her grandmother's closest friend, another seamstress who had worked in the same building. "I know you disapprove of what I do," the letter read, "and I cannot blame you for your judgment. You ask me how I can live with myself, and the truth is that some days I cannot. But you must understand that I did not choose this path because I enjoyed the power or the money. I chose it because I learned, at great cost, that the world is not fair to women like us. We work ourselves to exhaustion for wages that barely keep us alive, while men make fortunes from our labor. We are invisible until we are needed, and disposable the moment we are not. The women I help, because yes, Rose, I help them even if you cannot see it that way, they come to me when they have no other options. A husband who beats them. A business partner who steals from them. A landlord who threatens them. I give them the means to protect themselves, to escape, to survive. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, so be it. But I will not apologize for refusing to be helpless." This letter revealed a dimension to her grandmother's activities that the other documents had only hinted at. She had not simply been extracting money from the wealthy and powerful for her own benefit. She had been operating a kind of underground service for women who needed leverage against men who had wronged them. The realization made Margaret's hands shake as she continued reading. Another letter, this one from 1925, detailed a case in which her grandmother had helped a young factory worker gather evidence that her supervisor had been embezzling company funds, evidence that the woman then used to force him to stop his pattern of sexual harassment. The letter described how the supervisor, faced with proof of his theft, had resigned rather than face exposure, and how the young woman had been able to continue working without fear. "She cried when she thanked me," her grandmother had written. "She said I had saved her life. Perhaps that is an exaggeration, but I know what it is to feel trapped, to believe there is no escape. If I can offer even one woman a way out, then perhaps my own past was not entirely wasted." The reference to her grandmother's own past intrigued Margaret, but the letters provided no clear explanation. There were hints, a mention of what happened in New York in one document, a reference to the reason I left Boston in another, but nothing concrete. What became clear as Margaret worked through the bundle was that her grandmother had been operating this secret enterprise for at least 5 years, possibly longer, and that she had been remarkably successful at it. The ledger showed steady income, growing contacts, and an expanding network of clients and informants. By 1927, she appeared to have been managing what amounted to a small detective agency, though one that operated entirely outside the law and dealt exclusively in information that could be weaponized. But then the ledger entries stopped abruptly in November 1927. The final entry read simply, "Operation concluded. All materials destroyed. This record to be hidden." No explanation was offered for why she had suddenly ceased her activities or what had prompted her to hide rather than destroy this particular set of documents. Margaret flipped through the remaining papers, hoping for clarity, and found one last letter, undated and unsigned, written in a hand that trembled with either age or emotion. "To whoever finds this," it began, "I imagine you are a family member, perhaps the daughter I never had, or a granddaughter who never knew me as I truly was. By the time you read this, I will be long gone, and whatever judgment you pass on my actions, I will not be here to defend them. I want you to know that I am not proud of everything I did. I hurt people who probably did not deserve to be hurt as badly as I hurt them. I kept secrets that might have been better revealed. I profited from the pain and fear of others, even when I told myself I was serving a higher purpose. But I also helped women who had nowhere else to turn. I gave them weapons when they were defenseless. I taught them that they did not have to accept abuse and exploitation as the natural order of things. If you judge me harshly for my methods, I understand. But I hope you will also understand that I did what I had to do to survive in a world that did not care whether I lived or died. And if my story serves any purpose, I hope it will be to remind you that women have always found ways to fight back, even when those ways were hidden, illegal, and morally ambiguous. We do what we must. We endure. We survive." Margaret sat in the corner of the auction room, the papers spread across her lap, tears streaming down her face. Around her, people continued to browse, to examine, to appraise, completely unaware of the revelation that had just shattered her understanding of her own family history. Her grandmother had not been a simple seamstress living a life of quiet dignity. She had been a fighter, a strategist, a woman who had created power for herself in an era that denied women almost every form of agency. She had walked a moral tightrope, doing things that Margaret could not entirely condone but could not entirely condemn either. The grandmother Margaret had known, gentle, reserved, always slightly sad, had been only the surface. Beneath that exterior had lived someone far more complicated, someone who had seen and done things that left scars too deep to share. The auction was about to begin. Margaret carefully returned the documents to their hidden compartment, replaced the false bottom, and closed the lid of the jewelry box. When the auctioneer called the lot number, she raised her paddle without hesitation. No one else bid. For $22, she became the owner of her grandmother's secrets. As she carried the box out of the auction house, she felt the weight of it in her arms, not the physical weight of wood and velvet, but the weight of stories that demanded to be told, truths that refused to stay buried, and questions that would never be fully answered. She thought about the women her grandmother had helped, the ones who had cried with gratitude and relief. She thought about the ones her grandmother had hurt, the men and women who had paid dearly to keep their secrets hidden. She thought about the moral calculus that allowed someone to do both things simultaneously and still sleep at night. In the days that followed, Margaret began to investigate. She started with the names in the ledger, cross-referencing them with historical records, newspaper archives, and census data. Many of the individuals were long dead, but their stories were still recoverable. She found J.P., a respected banker who had been quietly forced into early retirement in 1924 under mysterious circumstances. She found Thiel, a society woman whose divorce had scandalized Chicago in 1925, though the newspapers had never reported the real reason for the split. She found W.K., a lawyer who had testified in a prominent trial, his testimony turning the case in favor of a young woman who had been accused of murdering her abusive husband. In each case, Margaret could trace a connection back to her grandmother, though the evidence was always circumstantial, always just shy of definitive proof. Her grandmother had been careful. She had left a trail just clear enough for someone who knew where to look but obscure enough to maintain deniability. The more Margaret learned, the more conflicted she became. On one hand, her grandmother had engaged in extortion and blackmail, crimes that had undoubtedly caused suffering. On the other hand, she had operated in a society that offered women almost no legal recourse against exploitation and abuse. The courts were dominated by men. The police were indifferent or actively hostile to women's complaints. The social services that might have provided help simply did not exist. In that context, what her grandmother had done began to look less like pure criminality and more like a form of guerrilla justice. Illegal, yes, but also necessary, or at least understandable. Margaret found herself thinking about the young factory worker, the one who had cried with gratitude. Without her grandmother's intervention, that woman might have lost her job, or worse. Was that not worth the moral compromise? And yet, Margaret also thought about the banker, J.P., whose career had ended in disgrace. Had he deserved that fate? What had he done to earn it? The documents offered no clear answer, only the notation, "Photographs secured." Margaret began to write. She did not know at first what form her writing would take, whether it would be a family history, a biography, or something more analytical. What emerged, over months of research and reflection, was a complex portrait of a woman who had refused to accept the limitations placed on her by her gender and her social class, but who had paid a significant emotional price for that refusal. The letters revealed a person who had been increasingly isolated as the years passed, who had lost friends like Rose because of her choices, who had never married or had children because her secret life made genuine intimacy impossible. The melancholy Margaret had observed in her grandmother, that sense of perpetual sadness, now made sense. It was the melancholy of someone who had won certain battles but lost the larger war, who had gained financial security and a measure of power but sacrificed connection and community in the process. One of the most revealing documents Margaret found was a letter her grandmother had written to Rose in 1927, shortly before she ended her operation. "You were right," it read. "I have become the thing I despised. I started this work because I wanted to protect women, to give them weapons against injustice. But somewhere along the way, I began to enjoy the power too much. I began to see people not as individuals with complex lives but as pieces on a board to be moved and manipulated. I took money from people who could not afford to pay, simply because I could. I justified my actions by telling myself I was fighting a corrupt system, but the truth is I became part of that corruption. I am ending this work not because I fear exposure, though I do fear it, but because I have finally recognized what you tried to tell me years ago, that the means matter as much as the ends, and that I cannot build a just world using unjust methods. I do not know what I will do now. I do not know how to be someone other than who I have become, but I know I cannot continue as I have been. Perhaps that is not redemption, but it is at least acknowledgement. I hope that is enough." This letter suggested that her grandmother's decision to stop had been driven by moral crisis rather than external pressure. She had looked at herself honestly and had not liked what she saw. That recognition, Margaret thought, was perhaps the most human aspect of the entire story. Her grandmother had not been a hero or a villain but a person trying to navigate impossible circumstances, making choices that were sometimes brave and sometimes cruel, sometimes selfless and sometimes selfish. She had been, in other words, exactly what we all are, flawed, complicated, and doing the best she could with the options available to her. As Margaret's research deepened, she began to uncover evidence of similar operations run by other women during the same period. Chicago in the 1920s, she learned, had been home to several informal networks of women who traded in information and leverage. Some were former private investigators who had been forced out of the profession by gender discrimination. Others were madams who used their positions to gather compromising information about their clients. Still others were society women who used their access to elite social circles to collect secrets and sell them to the highest bidder. What her grandmother had done was not unique. It was part of a larger underground economy that existed in the shadows of legitimate society, providing services that were illegal but also, in some sense, necessary. This realization prompted Margaret to think more broadly about the relationship between law, morality, and survival. Her grandmother had broken the law because the law did not protect women like her. She had engaged in morally questionable behavior because morally unquestionable behavior would have left her impoverished and vulnerable. Was that wrong? Certainly. Was it understandable? Also, certainly, Margaret found herself returning again and again to that uncomfortable space where condemnation and compassion coexisted, where she could neither fully defend nor fully condemn the choices her grandmother had made. It was a space without easy answers, without the comfort of moral clarity. The jewelry box itself became a kind of symbol for Margaret. Its innocent exterior concealing a hidden compartment felt like a perfect metaphor for her grandmother's life. Ordinary on the surface, extraordinary beneath. But it also represented the dangers of secrets, the way they corrode trust and connection, the way they isolate those who keep them. Margaret thought about her grandmother sitting alone in her small house, surrounded by the money she had earned through her secret work but unable to share her triumphs or her regrets with anyone. What a lonely existence that must have been, she thought. What a heavy burden to carry alone for so many years. Eventually, Margaret decided to donate the documents to a historical archive specializing in women's history. She did so anonymously, not wanting to expose her grandmother's identity or her own connection to the story. But she included a note explaining the significance of the collection and urging researchers to approach it with nuance and compassion. "These documents," she wrote, "tell the story of a woman who lived in a time when women had few options and fewer protections. What she did was illegal. Whether it was also wrong is a question I cannot answer. I offer these materials not to celebrate or condemn but to complicate our understanding of how ordinary people survive in unjust systems. We all make compromises. We all do things we are not proud of. The question is not whether we are perfect but whether we are human." The archive accepted the donation and eventually published a scholarly article based on the documents, situating Margaret's grandmother's activities within the broader context of early 20th century women's resistance to patriarchal structures. The article was careful not to romanticize blackmail or extortion but also careful to acknowledge the limited agency available to women of that era and the creative ways they found to assert power in a society designed to keep them powerless. Margaret read the article with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was glad that her grandmother's story was being told, that her struggles and her choices were being taken seriously by historians. On the other hand, she worried that the academic language, with its emphasis on structures and systems, lost something of the individual pain and complexity she had encountered in the letters. Her grandmother had not been a case study or a data point. She had been a person who had loved, suffered, made mistakes, and tried, in her own imperfect way, to make the world slightly less brutal for a few people. In the end, Margaret kept the jewelry box. She placed it on a shelf in her study, where she could see it every day. Sometimes she opened it and looked at the false bottom, now empty, thinking about what it had held and what it represented. Other times she simply looked at it, appreciating its worn velvet and tarnished brass, its humble beauty and its hidden depths. It reminded her that everyone has secrets, that every life contains multiplicities, and that the people we think we know are often strangers to us in crucial ways. It also reminded her that survival sometimes requires moral compromise, that justice is not always delivered through official channels, and that women have always been more resourceful, more resilient, and more complicated than history typically acknowledges. Years later, when Margaret's own daughter asked about the jewelry box and the grandmother she had never met, Margaret told her the whole story. She did not soften the details or make excuses. She presented the facts as she had discovered them: the blackmail, the extortion, the women who had been helped, the people who had been hurt, the moral ambiguity that saturated every aspect of the operation. Her daughter listened in silence, and when Margaret finished, she asked a single question: "Do you think she was a good person?" Margaret considered this carefully before answering. "I think she was a complicated person," she finally said. "I think she did some good things and some bad things, often for mixed reasons. I think she was brave and selfish, compassionate and ruthless, principled and pragmatic. I think, in other words, she was human. And I think that is the most important thing to remember about anyone, that they are never just one thing, that they contain multitudes, and that understanding them requires holding multiple truths at the same time, even when those truths contradict each other." The jewelry box, with its hidden compartment and its collection of secrets, had taught Margaret a crucial lesson about empathy and judgment. It had shown her that moral clarity is often a luxury available only to those who have never faced impossible choices. It had revealed the countless invisible struggles of ordinary women who navigated hostile systems with whatever tools they could find, legal or otherwise. And it had demonstrated that family history is rarely as simple as we want it to be, that our ancestors were not heroes or villains but people doing their best in circumstances we can barely imagine, leaving behind legacies that are as complicated and contradictory as they were themselves. The burgundy velvet had faded. The brass corners had tarnished. The ribbon holding the letters together had aged from white to ivory. But the questions the jewelry box contained remained as sharp and urgent as they had been in 1924. How do we survive in unjust systems? What compromises are acceptable? When does resistance become corruption? And how do we judge those who came before us, those who made choices we cannot fully understand from our position of retrospective comfort? These were not questions with easy answers. They were questions that demanded reflection, humility, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. They were, Margaret came to believe, the most important questions we can ask about anyone's life, including our own. The jewelry box sits on the shelf still, a small object with enormous weight, innocent on the surface, revelatory beneath. It waits, as all artifacts of hidden lives wait, for someone to look closely enough to see past the obvious, to detect the almost imperceptible seam, to press gently on the false bottom and discover what lies beneath the velvet. What it reveals is not comfortable or simple. It is the truth of human complexity in all its messy, compromised, and ultimately irreducible reality. And that truth, difficult as it may be to accept, is precisely what makes us who we are, not the stories we tell about ourselves in public, but the secrets we hide in compartments we hope will never be opened, the choices we make when no one is watching, and the legacies we leave behind for those who come after us to find, to judge, and perhaps, if we are fortunate, to understand. Margaret's daughter, Elena, grew up with the jewelry box as a fixture in her mother's study, but it wasn't until her own daughter, Margaret's granddaughter, turned 16 that the full weight of the story revealed itself in an unexpected way. The girl, named Rose after her great-great-grandmother's friend, had been researching a school project on women's labor movements in early 20th century Chicago when she stumbled across a digitized newspaper article from 1927. The headline read, "Mystery Woman Aids Factory Workers in Wage Dispute. Anonymous Benefactor Provides Evidence of Employer Fraud." The article described how documentation had mysteriously appeared at a labor attorney's office, proving that a garment factory owner had been systematically underpaying his primarily female workforce while falsifying records to hide the theft. The evidence had led to a settlement that recovered thousands of dollars in back wages for nearly 200 women. Rose brought the article to her grandmother, asking if it might be connected to the family story she had heard about. Margaret studied the dates, cross-referenced them with the ledger entries she had photographed years ago, and felt a chill run down her spine. There, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, was an entry from October 1927, factory records delivered. No payment requested. Final act. It had been one of the last entries before the operation ceased entirely. Her grandmother had not taken money for that particular intervention. She had simply done it because it needed to be done, because 200 women deserved the wages they had earned. Margaret realized that her understanding of her grandmother's final months had been incomplete. The moral crisis described in the letters had not simply led to cessation but to transformation. Her grandmother had tried, in those last weeks, to use her methods for something purely altruistic, to balance the scales somehow before walking away. This discovery prompted Margaret to return to the historical archive where she had donated the original documents. She requested access to her grandmother's collection, wanting to review it with fresh eyes and this new information. The archivist, a young woman named Dr. Keisha Morrison, had been studying the materials extensively and had made connections Margaret herself had not seen. Dr. Morrison had identified at least 17 separate cases where Margaret's grandmother had intervened on behalf of women facing various forms of abuse, exploitation, or injustice between 1922 and 1927. Some involved blackmail of the traditional sort, exchanging silence for money. But others were more complex, orchestrating evidence to appear at crucial moments, anonymously funding legal representation for women who could not afford it, creating paper trails that forced institutions to investigate their own corruption. Your grandmother, Dr. Morrison explained, was operating what we might now call a one-woman legal aid society, though her methods were entirely extra-legal. She understood something that many progressive reformers of her era did not, that the legal system itself was often the problem, not the solution, and that working within it would only perpetuate injustice. So she worked around it, through it, sometimes against it. Dr. Morrison had also uncovered something else: court records from Boston in 1919 involving a young seamstress who had accused her employer of sexual assault. The woman's name had been recorded as Helen Chin, the anglicized version of Margaret's grandmother's birth name. The case had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence and questionable character of the complainant, language typical of the era when women who made such accusations were routinely disbelieved and attacked. Margaret felt something break open inside her chest as she read the documents. This was the past her grandmother had referenced in her letters, the reason she had left Boston for Chicago, the experience that had taught her that official channels offered women no protection. She had sought justice through the proper means and had been destroyed for it. Of course, she had then created her own system. Of course, she had learned to fight in the shadows. What choice had she been given? The Boston court records included testimony from character witnesses brought by the employer's attorneys, men and women who had stood up in court and described Helen Chen as morally questionable, prone to fabrication, and seeking financial gain through false accusations. Margaret wondered how her grandmother had endured sitting in that courtroom, listening to her character systematically demolished by people who knew nothing about what had happened to her. She wondered what it had cost to walk out of that courthouse knowing that her attacker would face no consequences, that her reputation had been destroyed, and that the system designed to protect her had instead protected him. No wonder she had hidden this part of her history. No wonder she had never spoken of it. The shame of not being believed, the trauma of being publicly humiliated, these were not things anyone would want to carry into new relationships or share with family. But understanding the origin of her grandmother's work also complicated Margaret's feelings about the jewelry box and everything it represented. Her grandmother had not been simply a criminal or even a morally ambiguous vigilante. She had been a survivor who had learned through brutal experience that she could not rely on institutions to deliver justice, and who had then spent years trying to ensure other women did not have to learn that same lesson. The blackmail, the extortion, the manipulation, these were the tools of someone who had been failed by every legitimate authority and who had decided that if the system would not protect women, she would have to do it herself, by whatever means necessary. It did not make everything she had done right, but it made it comprehensible in a way Margaret had not fully grasped before. Dr. Morrison was planning to write a book about women who had operated similar underground networks during the early 20th century, and she asked Margaret if she would be willing to let her grandmother's story be included, this time with her real name attached. Margaret hesitated. She thought about her grandmother's desire for privacy, her careful concealment of her activities, her fear of exposure even decades after the fact. But she also thought about the women her grandmother had helped, about Rose with her school project, about all the young women who might benefit from knowing that their great-grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers had not been passive victims but active resistors, fighting back with whatever weapons they could forge. After a long pause, Margaret agreed with one condition: that the book include the Boston court records, the full story of what had been done to her grandmother and how it had shaped everything that came after. Dr. Morrison agreed immediately. The book, when it was published 3 years later, became a minor sensation in academic circles and beyond. It challenged romantic notions of women's suffrage-era activism by showing the much messier, more morally complicated reality of how many women actually survived and fought back. Reviews were mixed. Some praised it for its unflinching honesty, others criticized it for seemingly celebrating criminal behavior.